Welcome to the She Did It Her Way podcast, where it's all about making the ultimate leap from your 9 to 5 and building a business and life you love, all while doing it your way. I'm your host, Amanda Boleyn. Let's get started. Hello, She Did It Her Way listeners. Welcome back for another episode of the podcast. If you are new here and this is your first time tuning in, welcome. We are so excited and grateful to have you. Today, I am sitting down with our amazing guest, Kelly Butler, and I'm so excited for you to hear her journey and her story on how not only we met, but more importantly, her story and journey of making her ultimate leap. So we're going to be diving into some of her journey and her story and what ultimately made her decide to make her ultimate leap. Kelly is an interior stylist, coach, and the passionate founder of Gratify Home, where she teaches women to sustainably style homes they love while leaving a positive impact in this world. She does this through virtual one-on-one interior style coaching. So that's designing directly with her clients, and virtual room e-design. And that is designed for you and done for you. Kelly, welcome to the She Did It Her Way podcast.
Thank you, Amanda. I am so excited to be here.
Me too. I am so pumped for you to share your story because I know and believe that these stories on how women go out and quit their job and make their ultimate leap, because it is such a scary experience when you're living it. But once you're on the other side, it's like a whole different world opens up. So love for you to share in your own words. I shared a little bit about what you do, but tell us in your own words. And then let's kind of dial back the time to how this all started.
Absolutely. So you mentioned a little bit in the intro, of course, but I just get so excited to help women overcome their sense of overwhelm in their own homes. And the women that I work with are curious about how they can be leaving a positive legacy. And they're curious about the food they're putting into their body, where their stuff is coming from, and they want to translate those values into their home, but they just feel stuck in knowing how to do that. And so for women who really want to educate themselves, invest in themselves, I teach them, in essence, how to be their own sustainable interior stylist. And then I work with some women who just say, you know what, this isn't my bag. It's not my jam, but I really want a space that I can be proud of. And for those women, I do virtual e-design, which has been great actually during the pandemic. And I do that service for them so that they can create a space that they love and do it sustainably. And so that's a little bit about what I'm doing now. And if we talk about how this all started, I think
I'm so curious. So I love that. And I think it is such a great example of, anything is possible in this world in terms of what it is that you want to do with your business. But yeah, take us back to the moment that you realized you're I don't want to be working my corporate job and I want to do something different. Take us back to that moment.
So I'm a pretty stubborn and hard-headed, as it turns out. And so I think that it's taken me some time. It took me some time to actually listen to the intuition. And I think for so many years, I really was thinking only with my head, and just coming in almost a 20-year corporate background. That's kind of how we had been trained to operate. And so the first inkling that I had, I remember I was walking down a row of cubicles in my corporate office, and I heard this voice say, "You're not supposed to be here." And I thought, well, that was really strange and kind of cuckoo, but it was almost a whisper, but it was a loud whisper that really, really stuck with me. I remember exactly what spot I was standing in, exactly where in the office I was when I heard that. And I just began to realize that my heart was not in the work that I was doing in corporate. And I think it was for so many reasons, but I'm a naturally creative person. I had to decide whether I was going to go to art school or a traditional university, which I chose to get a marketing degree and take that path, which I don't regret doing. But I feel that there was a lot of pent up creativity in there that just had to be let out. And I feel that it was really being suppressed in the work that I was doing. And not only that, but just the impact that I was having. And Amanda, we can get into it certainly a little bit later about an assignment that I took in India that was very life-changing toward that journey as well. But it all started with that voice that I heard that day in the office.
Oh my goodness. So many things. What year was that you heard that voice?
2018.
2018. Okay, perfect. Just to give some context in terms of like timeline, not because I want listeners, I don't want you guys to compare your journey to Kelly's, but I think chronologically it's helpful to follow along, right? Everyone's lead up is so different. So you cannot compare your lead up to someone else's or compare it to Kelly. So keep that in mind. And I do want to touch on too, that you said it took you years to listen to your intuition. What was different about that time when you heard you're not supposed to be here versus like maybe other nudges that you've had prior to that?
I think that it began with this choice that I wanted to make to be more self-aware. And before, the way that I was operating, I guess the best way that I can describe it was just when you're in your car and you just turn on cruise control and you're really just not thinking. And I find that I was operating that way in my life. I was going about every day in my career with my family as though this was a path that I was sort of being forced to take. It was the path. It was what I was supposed to do, should do. And that was manifesting itself in everything that I was doing. And I'm ashamed to say this now, but it's like, I almost had this badge of honor about being busy. Like, look how busy I am. Look how much I'm doing. Right. And I used to hear about other people meditating or writing in a journal. And I used to kind of scoff and be like, oh, must be nice, to take the time to do that. And it was a wrong way because I was so focused on the doing, the actions, and it wasn't at all a focus on being in touch with, really what it is that I stopped to ask myself, what is it that you want instead of what do you have to do or you feel you have to do? And I think it was just that first step was an awareness to say, I want to be more aware. And I think that there are choices here if I can stop and listen.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that too. And I think that first step of awareness is key and so crucial. And I think, I'd have to imagine too, there's probably some of that resistance where it's like, we have this identity in the corporate life and in whatever life we're living. And to think that we are going to change or be someone different can be really scary. And I'm sure for you and listeners as well, like tuning in, like going there and allowing yourself to honor that voice can be a little scary because you're like, oh crap. Like once I honor that, you can't unhear it. And so it sticks with you.
You're so right. You can't turn the dial backward and go back to being unaware.
Yeah.
Once you've made the choice or that you've opened your mind up to the possibility that there is an alternative path, there's no going back from that point.
Yeah. It's so, oh, wow. Okay. So I'm really excited to continue going here. So you hear that voice, that's in 2018. What sort of follows after that? Like, what does life look like? And take us through that timeline.
Yeah. Well, not long after that voice spoke to me, I was sitting in my home office on a Friday afternoon, just minding my own business. And I got a phone call out of the blue that changed everything for me. And if I want to rewind a year before to 2017, I had applied to this program at my company called the Corporate Service Corps. And in essence, it's a team of global employees who are deployed into a developing nation for 30 days and who basically do pro bono consulting for a nonprofit. And it is an absolute life-changing experience. It's something that I'd wanted to do for years. And I finally worked up the courage and I submitted my application. And then it'd been a year and I really just sort of forgot about it. And that afternoon in 2018, the phone rang and I was offered a slot with a team to go to Mumbai, India, and work with an education nonprofit in some of the poorest slums in Mumbai. And I was told I had to make a decision by Monday. So my poor husband was like a deer in headlights, but thankfully, he knew how much it meant to me. He knew how much I was craving this idea of like throwing myself into the deep end, into doing something that made me so incredibly uncomfortable and seeing things I'd never seen before and pushing myself to add value and contribute in a different way. And so we decided that it was going to be possible for me. And I went on that assignment in 2018. And as I worked with that nonprofit, as I walked through these communities with a scarf over my mouth to cover the odor. And as I dehydrated myself in the morning because there would be no bathroom for me to go to in the slums. And as I sat with these mothers who were learning how to be advocates for their children's learning, it was incredibly transformational, very uncomfortable, very emotional, but that made me become very obsessed with sustainable business models, how to use commerce and business as a way to alleviate poverty in a way that goes beyond giving or volunteering, but in a way that is sustainable for artisans, that preserves cultural craft. And I had this uncomfortable tension when I got back home to Atlanta, and I just knew I was never going to be the same. And that kind of curiosity and obsession around these sustainable business models is really what took me in the direction to create Gratify.
Okay. So that was 2017. The voice came in 2018. Then what?
Yeah. So after that, I really I was feeling lost. I was kind of feeling like I was out in the ocean without a lifeboat. And it was just, I felt in such conflict. And so I really went through a series of discomfort. You know, there was a lot of crying, there was a lot of asking questions. And one day, as I was sitting in my home office with my husband, Jeff, and he looked at me and he said, "I think you're ready to start your own business." And I thought that was absurd. I said, "There's no way. I don't even have an idea. What are you even talking about?" You know?
Yeah.
But that seed was planted there. And he went away for the weekend, and I went to Target and I bought a journal, and on the front of it, it said, "Create your own path." And that's where I allowed myself to start feeling that intuition and just began to write some things that were on my mind and how I could really, go in this direction while I was still working my corporate job. But how could I funnel this passion and this discomfort and tension into something productive? And so I decided the first step in my business was to open an online boutique selling goods for women in home, and that were fair trade, that were artisan made, and that really uplifted the makers from across the world. And I wanted to introduce these beautiful goods into women and into their homes. And so I just started to curate this collection. I started reaching out to my friends and asking if I could, host parties in their homes and invite other women to come in. And I had a launch party at my home. And so I began to really, put my all into this product-based business, as a first step while I was still working my corporate job.
Okay. So you started with product while working your corporate job. I have so many questions for you, like as we go through this. So I'm like just creating a database of questions, but what was it like building your business while working your corporate job? And let me back up too. I love that you shared that one of the first things you did after you heard this voice was simply go out and buy a journal and just write about it and journal and give it space, as opposed to like, oh my gosh, I need to do and like hurry up, get into something. It was just creating that space. So I think that's a really great point that I want to call out for listeners, that if you are feeling similar to like how Kelly felt, give yourself some space and write it and kind of like process what's going on to let it marinate and create that space. And so then you started with the physical product. So when you started with the physical product while working full time, was this still in 2018 or had we moved into 2019 at that point?
Yeah. So really we're moving into it's the tail end of 2018. And so at that point I was just following my gut. I really didn't know that much about what I was doing, but I just called out that, okay, I'm just going to start. I'm just going to make this work. And so I gave myself a pretty short timeline. And because I'm coming from a corporate background, maybe you out there listening can also relate, but I had this kind of a perfectionist mindset because I'd been taught to always produce A+ work, right? Everything that you do needs to be your very best. if something's not ready, you can push out your project timeline. You want it to be perfect, right? And so a lot of that was really trying to identify and unlearn those corporate type principles. And I had to get comfortable with producing work that I knew wasn't perfect, but that it was better to get something out there than it was to be perfect. And that's really how I started.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. And I talked about this on a previous solo cast, is that as a high performer, the biggest thing that will ball you up and stop you is, or let me back up. One of the biggest things that you have to unlearn is this idea that everything has to be perfect before you can ship it. And it's really encouraging. Like it's almost, I would say, and I'm curious what you say, Kelly, is like, it is a muscle to practice and get comfortable with things not being perfect. And at first it can be really scary because if you've been in corporate, whether it's only been a year or like 20 years, you build up this identity and this muscle that everything has to be perfect before you can actually like ship it or move. And definitely like there's a time and a place where that tool and that muscle is useful. But when you're getting started on building your business, you have to let that go. So what were some things like, you're like, okay, I don't care. It's not perfect. I just need to do it. Or like, what was that like?
Yeah. So I did recognize in myself that I'm a perfectionist, and it's no surprise. And people tell me that. You can go, ask my husband, even my kids, like that's not a hard trait to spot about me. And so again, kind of going back to that awareness, Amanda, I think, making the decision to start being more self-aware, identifying other options, and then looking at yourself, stepping away and looking at yourself as an objective observer and spotting, what do you think my biggest challenges are going to be? And I knew that perfectionism was a big one for me. And so what I tried to do was just focus on the why, focus on the mission that I had, the fire that I felt to get this business started, and why I thought it was important to the world. And if I kind of got that tendency to want to overanalyze, overthink, wordsmith in an unending way, play around with images and all this BS, like I would just, say to myself, okay, what's more important? Like, why are you doing this? Right. And if you can focus on that why, then I think that can help you to let go of that natural tendency to want to overcomplicate or overthink.
Yeah. And the whole like fixing and updating a website or changing the email copy and all these things that are behind the scenes. And yes, they matter to some extent. They're all helpful, right? But a lot of it's passive action. And it's so important to take that massive action. So getting out there, talking to people, actually like seeing what's broken, what's not working, like that's going to get you for so much further along and move you through your journey faster than it is trying to like think your way out of it. So I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I know that you pivoted from physical product to now into virtual services. What was that like? And then also talk to us about the ultimate leap from your corporate job.
All right. So I'll talk about the pivot first. So the pivot happened as, again, I just was seeing what was working for me, reflecting on what was working and what wasn't in my business. And I think that this is something, it never stops, right? So at that point, I realized that I was still hiding in some ways. I felt that I really wasn't going as all in as I wanted to. I wasn't making the impact that I wanted to. And although it was so much fun bringing these amazing goods from artisans into women's homes, I really wanted to create deeper one-on-one relationships with the women that I was working with. And I wanted to be part of a bigger transformation in their lives. And I also have this passion for interior design, interior styling, coming from that artistic background that I have. And I just recognized a gap in the market for sustainable and approachable interior styling. And as I started to really apply some of the principles from my trip to India and how I could style my home in sustainable ways, I just wasn't finding the content that I needed help with. And so I just asked myself the question, why not me? Why shouldn't I be the one then to stand in and fill this void? And so I also, just to be honest, it's like I hated the inventory part of the business. I hated the the shipping and the packing tape. I mean, that was like my worst enemy. I would have it stuck everywhere but on the box. And, these are certainly things that I could have outsourced, but it was really about that transformation and the depth of relationships that I wanted to create. And so I made the decision. It was really scary because that was my security blanket. A product is something that someone can touch, see, feel, people understand it. But switching into a virtual type of service, people don't understand that as much. And I recognized that there was a part of me that it was afraid to pivot because people wouldn't understand or people wouldn't approve. That's that sort of pleaser in me, right? And for me, it was hard to finally cut the cord. And so I made the decision that early in 2020, I was going to hold basically a closing sale, and I was going to do huge promotion and lead up, and I was going to sell all the remaining inventory because that was going to force me to cut the cord and go all in on transitioning into virtual and a digital business model.
I love that you create an environment of like constraint for yourself where you set it up in a way that you're like, I'm not giving myself an out. I'm not giving myself a choice. Like I have to sell it. Like when I sell this means that I have to pivot. That's so great.
Thank you. And, I think right after that, kind of following along that same timeline, when I made that pivot in 2020, this was last February. And then I had a really, really unexpected curveball that life threw at me. And in March, I became really ill and I was sick with a virus and thought it was probably COVID and was sick for a couple of weeks. And then as I began to recover, I just fully couldn't feel better. And I noticed that especially my legs were just getting weaker and weaker. And I thought, gosh, it's really taken me a long time to recover. And so I called the doctor and it was getting worse and worse until one day I could not stand up on my own and I could not chew. I was having trouble speaking. And so Jeff drove me to the ER. And last April, I was diagnosed with a debilitating neurological disorder called Guillain-Barré syndrome. So I was in the hospital because this was during the pandemic. I had completely lost control over my body and none of my family could be there with me. And it was so scary. And I had these lumbar punctures and MRIs and all sorts of things. And I felt like I had gone from a healthy 41-year-old person into an 85-year-old's body. And I was on a walker. And if there was any distance that I had to go, I was in a wheelchair. And my doctor sat me down and he said, you have to know how long this recovery is going to take. This is going to take months. And then my second opinion said 1 to 3 years until I was going to recover. And so I was in the hospital for a week, got a lot of life-saving plasma treatments, and I couldn't even climb up one stair. So I rehabbed at my mom's house away from my family for about a month. And just looking at the stairs in my home, it was like Mount Everest. It literally is what that felt like to me. And so I embarked on this health journey in 2020 during the pandemic and went through 9 months of physical and occupational therapy. I was so weak, I couldn't hold a coffee cup without using two hands. I couldn't stand in the shower. And so I had to rely on the friends and family and the support around me. And I was again forced to go introspectively and to make a decision about how I was going to choose to see what was happening to me and how I was going to assign a meaning to that and make a choice about how I was going to deal with it.
Wow. Appreciate you sharing that. That's it. I'm just like a loss for words. That is crazy. I mean, that our health is such our wealth, and any time that it is remotely altered in that capacity is definitely no small feat. So would you say that was kind of the moment where you're like, I need to do this and I got to go all in?
Yes, that's it, Amanda, because as I was lying there, it forced me to think about a drastic reprioritization in my life. And of course, first of all, I recognized that I had not been prioritizing my health. I consider myself mostly healthy, but I wasn't making daily decisions with health at the forefront. And I realized very quickly that without my health, I really had nothing. And so I started to let go of those clinging, remaining, incessant sort of fears about what people would think. And I started to feel this really increased sense of urgency, like the time is now, because I saw how quickly things could change in my life. And the thought of going back to corporate, the thought of going back and joining days of conference calls and like losing the freedom that I had to make pro health choices through the day, giving up that freedom and not feeling completely lit up with the legacy that I was leaving and the work that I was doing and the people I was serving, it became unbearable for me to think about that. And so that is really what lit my fire. And ironically, I felt so lit on fire and I was so sick that I couldn't really work. So I started just returning to work literally 15 minutes at a time. And I would make space to do something creatively in my home. One day I said, I'm going to redesign, I'm going to restyle my coffee table. And it exhausted me. I did that and then I laid down, but I found a way to share it on social media. I found a way to try to turn that into some content. And I allowed myself 15 minutes at a time. And when I relapsed in September, I was back in the hospital again, lost the ability to walk and had to overcome that for a second time. But the reason that I share this with you, Amanda, and with your listeners is that the road to our dreams, the road to our leap is not easy. It's not always easy. It's different for every person, but I just hope that sharing all that I've been through to make that leap reinforces the commitment, the drive, the fire, the choice that I felt. And I just hope that it will inspire you listening to know that you can also do it, no matter what comes your way. If it's in your heart, if it's the burning desire that you feel, it is possible.
Amen to that. And when you were sharing your story, and for those of you tuning into the podcast, if you've been listening, you know, one of my favorite quotes is by the late Wayne Dyer, that when we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. And there are so many moments in your story about how you could have looked at your circumstance in one lens, but you chose to look at it through a different lens, which therefore changed the meaning, which therefore changed the emotion and the energy behind it so that you stayed connected to your why and you kept going. And exactly what you said, every lead up is so different. And it's so important to stay focused on your individual lead up and not look at someone else's as a comparison, but use it as inspiration and acknowledgement of like, okay, so it can take 2 years to fully get out of my own. It can take 12 months to go out on my own. So what was the day? What was your leap day exactly?
Yeah. So my most official leap day is actually next Wednesday, March 31st.
Yay!
But yay. So I made the decision early in this year, 2021, that I was not going to come back to corporate. And it was a huge relief mixed with feeling completely scared, at the same time. But I have learned that the fear isn't a bad thing. You've got to work through it and with it. And I've appreciated, Amanda, so much listening to your podcast and the sage advice that you offer and that your previous guests have offered about being smart about that leap. And, whether it be building up sufficient revenue to be able to leap or sufficient savings. And for me, it was the latter. And I think that, my husband and I, taking this type of a risk, honestly, I never saw myself doing. Very conservative. Guarding over my 401k like a nervous mother hen. But really my husband and I had come to the agreement that we have saved, quote unquote, for a rainy day, right? But what if we save for a sunshiny day? What if instead of waiting for the worst to happen, we use this money for a possibility, for a dream for me? And so I'm still learning to let go and know that because I've had a really successful 20-year corporate career, it's not going to be overnight that I'm going to be making up that revenue, but having the savings and having a plan, talking to my financial advisor, talking to college consultants, because my oldest son is a junior in college right now, or in high school looking to go to college, and surrounding myself with experts who can let me see other options that earlier in my life I didn't see. And so I think being willing to take a calculated risk and knowing why you've saved, in my opinion, is it because you were waiting on something terrible, or is it because you're willing to place a bet on something wonderful?
I love that reframe. And I think that, right, everyone's leap is different. Everyone's risk threshold is different. There's so many stories of women that I've interviewed that would not leap until they replaced X percentage of their income. There's women that would not leap until credit card debt was paid off. There's women that took the leap, even though they had hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loan debt. So like, it is definitely an honest conversation with every individual with themselves and their partners, if they're married or what have you, or however that looks like. That is so crucial. And you had also said having a plan in place to make sure that you're supported as you build your business and along the way. And I think I want to point that out too, because it's so like one thing that I've seen like as a pitfall, and this isn't you at all based on what you're sharing, is like this idea that, okay, I'm going to quit and then I'll figure it out. Where if you don't do even the slightest due diligence as you have your full-time job, like that exposes you to a lot of risk and a lot of like mental chatter, right? Like, cause so many things we think like we have the best laid plans in our brains of how like our launch is going to go. And then we do the launch and we think we're going to like sell out and make $10,000. And then the launch happens and it's crickets and it's like, oh my gosh. And like brain freaks out. Right. So love that you shared your leap and your journey and like how you have planned for it. And I'm so excited for you. How are you finding support right now as you're building your business?
Yeah. So I think for me, I'm naturally an introvert. So I'm a person who has a few very, very close friends, and I can make small talk, but I'd much prefer to go much deeper in a conversation. And so for me, I've had to overcome a little bit of discomfort with having this online presence. And I would say that this is going to be a work in progress for me for a while. And that's okay as long as I'm continuing to improve. But one thing that I challenged myself to do, and when I reflected on the pivot that I made, so going back to when I was just doing physical product, I realized that I had not been very smart about collaborations and about identifying others that I could work with where we would both benefit from bringing content or something fresh to our audiences. And so one thing that I challenged myself to do, this was just even a couple of months ago as I was still, working through my recovery, but I told myself, do 3 things this week that scare the hell out of you. And they were 3 things that my logical brain kept telling me you're not ready to do. Oh, that person has too large an audience. So you're not quite where you need to be, but maybe in 6 months, reach out to them. Right. And so I forced myself to do that. And I put a little bit of thought into just a very informal pitch and thought about how I would reach out. And actually all 3 of them resulted in collaborations right now that we found mutual benefit in doing Facebook Lives or doing Instagram Lives, blog posts, other things that benefit both of our audiences and will help me as a newer business owner to expand the scope and the scale and the exposure of my own audience. But if I'd kept listening to that voice in my head, I still would be sitting here doing it myself. So I think it's about identifying ways to collaborate and understanding you're going to be told no, but I actually track when somebody says no, and I look back at how I pitched and I think about how I could do it better. And I look at where they said yes, and I try to identify and ask them, what made them say yes. And so that I can just keep getting better and better. But if I just focus on the no's, I'm not going to get anywhere. And so do it before you think you're ready and focus on learning through the process, even if you get told no a few times.
Yes, I love that. Exercise that muscle. Just get out there and do it and take that action, become aware of the thoughts that your brain is trying to tell you to keep you like held back, or, that thought, which I think is a lie, of like, oh, you're not ready yet, or, oh, you're not big enough, right? Like that's just our brain trying to protect us. And once we recognize that, we're like, okay, like nothing scary is actually going to happen. What have I got to lose? I love that. What are 3 actionable things or items you recommend new business owners doing when they're starting out or thinking of starting their business?
Well, I think the first one is recognizing that no matter where you are in your journey, you do have a network. And so, really assessing your network and thinking about how you can leverage it in an authentic way. And I share this one because this is a lie that I told myself, that somehow this 20-year network that I'd created in corporate wasn't going to be valuable, as I made this leap. And I remember being on a call with my mentor, Julie Ciardi, who has also been a previous guest on your podcast. But yeah, I love Julie.
Yep.
But she heard me say out loud on the coaching call, my network is poor. And she called my butt out on that statement right away. And she really reframed it with me. And it wasn't that I have a poor network. I've been leveraging my network poorly. Ouch.
Yes.
But it was so true, right? So with that reframe, I began to think about, okay, well, how have I or haven't I been leveraging this network? And how can I do that better or differently and use that, to propel my business? And so that would be the first advice, is to assess your network and think about how to leverage it in an authentic way. The second thing is to seek out like-minded women who are on a similar path than you are. And, one of the ways that I did this was, Amanda, where I met you, which was back in 2019, is going to the She Did It Her Way Summit, right?
Yes. Oh, it feels so long ago.
With real people in the same room. It feels,
I know. What a concept.
I know. It seems so strange, but the women that I met there, it's just, you cannot replace that in-person feeling. So I'm so hopeful that we're going to get back to that very soon post-pandemic, but seeking out women who are on a similar path. And if you can't do it in person, doing it through podcast like this one. And because the friends around you love you and would lay down in the road for you, but they don't fully get it. And that's okay. You need to look to others who are on a similar path to help fill your cup in a different way. And, at that summit, I came away not only feeling so inspired, but I met Elizabeth Joy there at that summit. And she actually serves a similar audience in the conscious and sustainable fashion space. And so we have kept in touch, and actually just this week released a collaborative blog post about what sustainable interior design is and how to make the transition from a sustainable conscious closet into interiors. And when we do that, it lifts us both up. She's able to provide fresh content. I'm able to help grow my audience. And we wouldn't have met had it not been for that connection at the summit.
Oh, I love that. And I'll just say one little thing about events, whether they're in person or virtual, which obviously I love in person. And hopefully with the summit, we're looking at fall of 2021 and crossing our fingers that by that time, we'll be in some sort of position where people feel safe to be in person. But if not, it still will happen and it'll be virtual. But I want to offer up, whether it's the summit or if it's another event, like even if you don't know exactly the business you want to start, or you're just not exactly sure, like what the heck's going on, trust me, I've been there. You will not walk away from any event empty-handed, of not learning something, of not having an idea spark. Part of the journey is just putting yourself and surrounding yourself with like-minded people to be in that energy and that space. Even if you don't know exactly what the outcome will be or the key takeaway that you're going to get, knowing that you're going to walk away with something, and that something will be unveiled to you once you're in that arena, once you're in that space. And so I just want to offer that, like, sometimes we can think our brains are like, I don't know what the takeaway is going to be, and I don't really know what I'm going to get out of it. And sometimes it's not about that. It's just getting yourself in that space, taking that course, learning something new, allowing that space to spark something different. So I just wanted to share that quick. So thank you for letting me share that, Kelly. And what is your third thing?
I love it. I agree with what you just said. wholeheartedly, and just overcoming that belief in corporate that you should know all the answers, right? And I think that's, again, unlearning some of that you may be looked down upon if you're asking for help on a project or something. That in the entrepreneurial space, you have to be asking for help. You have to be proactively seeking. And the third thing is, I would say, start with one thing, and that there is no right thing. And so you start and you decide that that's the right thing, and you stay with it. Because I think something that I've struggled with is this kind of shiny object syndrome, or if you're not seeing immediate results, you begin to question, well, maybe I chose the wrong thing. Maybe this should be my product, or maybe I need to be doing this instead. And I think that the learning does come from repetition and tweaking. But if you're constantly questioning what you started with, you are using so much mental space that you could be using to actually progress and perfect whatever decision you've made on how to start. And so you're doing several things halfway. And so there's no limit to the ideas and the creativity. That was another limiting belief that I had before, was that somehow my ideas were going to run out. But creativity begets creativity. And so have faith in starting with that one thing and repeat, give yourself time. And if you want to pivot, you can always pivot, but there is no right or wrong first thing.
Oh, so two really good key nuggets that I want to take away from that is that ultimately it comes down to actively choosing what it is that you want to continue with, and continuing to choose that thing even when it looks like it's not quote unquote working, because things work. They may take time, but it's that relentless commitment to your why and what you're doing that ultimately drives those outcomes. And when you were saying that, it kind of hit me. It was like, it's kind of like a relationship. I almost feel like that you choose to love, you choose to be in a relationship with someone. Like, it's an active choice, and deciding ahead of time that that's what you're going to do and commit to it. So I love that, picking that one thing and committing and deciding. And in the beginning, maybe you're doing a handful of different things for the first 3 months just to kind of flesh out, see what you like, but then choose one thing to go all in, and do that for a year, and just practice going all in and sticking with it to build up that muscle and that habit before wanting to pivot and tweak. Okay, I would love to transition into the rapid fire round. This has been so fun, and so many amazing nuggets have come out of our conversation. I could talk to you I could talk like another hour for sure.
Totally.
Tell us a little bit about, like, what is a non-negotiable for you?
So I think my non-negotiable is not necessarily a thing, but it's a belief and a principle. And that principle is that I always have a choice, and I am not the victim of life's circumstances.
Amen to that. Yes. When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And when you start asking different questions, you're going to start getting different answers. Love it. What is a quote that you live by, or a mantra?
Amanda, you're not going to believe this, but I have the Wayne Dyer quote. So it is.
Oh my gosh, no way.
Yeah, totally. So change the way you look at things, and the things you look at change. And I think that was something when I was sitting in a shower chair in the shower last year, or being pushed in a wheelchair by my mom to a doctor's appointment, that it was up to me. And I think you can carry this too far and get into a toxically positive space, which I know isn't healthy, but I had to repeat myself, this particular quote each and every day, because it was about how I chose to look at things. And I think this is my number one quote.
Oh, I did not know that. I love that. It was so good. So good. What's been one of your favorite books to read? It could be business, it could be fiction.
Let me think about this one. I would say I really enjoyed reading Profit First. And this one's been around for a few years, and I have heard it mentioned on several podcasts. And I think that it was the first framework that I had of thinking differently, not as a corporate employee, but as a business owner, and making sure that I could pay myself and how to get paid first. And it gives a framework for, putting expenses and things into different categories and seeing it in a simplistic way. And I guess the only caveat would be, as I'm evolving as an entrepreneur, I'm definitely want to create this different category of investment and return on investment, and not artificially capping the investment that I put into something in my business that's going to offer immediate return. I don't want to treat that like an office expense or a software expense, but that is a wonderful, I think, first step in thinking about your cash flow and your revenues in an easy to understand way.
Yeah. And I'll just like echo the love for profit first. That I wish I would have read that book in 2012 when I quit my job and became a freelancer, because and as a business owner, when you're starting out, your cash flow is like high, it's low, it's inconsistent. And so Profit First really gives a roadmap on how to create consistency in a world where it might be inconsistent, and how do you save based on percentages, not necessarily, or like how do you organize your money based on percentages, not necessarily dollar amounts. It's so good. So good. Love it. What's the best $100 or less purchase one can make in their business?
Okay, this is so basic, but I have to say I love Google Drive. And so I think it costs just under $12 a month. So it'll give you $100, it'll give you almost a full year. And for me, I'm so ADD and I've got a creative mind. And so the organizational piece sometimes is not something that comes naturally to me, but being able to quickly create notes, quickly create slides or spreadsheets and have that organized in Google Drive and easily searchable from all of my devices. If I pick up my phone, if I pick up my MacBook, and be able to easily share it with others. And so that's just like a very basic organizational software that's very inexpensive, but something that's helped me tremendously.
Yes. Organized from the start is so key. And I think that if you use Squarespace to get your domain and to use for your website, I think they have an option where you can also get the Google Drive, which is for the business, called Google Workspace. So you can get that bundled. So that's even a bonus there. Yay. So Kelly, as we're winding down, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners before we wrap up today? It's just been so amazing.
Well, I'm so grateful to be here. And I would say that for me, it is such a full circle type of a moment, because the She Did It Her Way podcast was the very first podcast that I ever listened to. And I would be driving from my house in the suburbs into the office, and some of the women that you were interviewing, some of the conversations that you were sharing on your Solocast, Amanda, I would literally be in tears, and I would be sitting in the parking lot about to walk into the office and dabbing at my mascara. And I just want to say that back then, the first step was just opening your mind to the possibility. And I felt like I'd been woken up from a nap, and looking around at this world around me that I just had no idea existed. But it's been so incredibly fulfilling. And I just want to encourage everybody listening that is so possible, even if right now you're only listening. Maybe that's all that you're doing, is you've started to open your mind and you're just listening. That is awesome. And it is so possible for you to take the next step beyond listening. And so much of it is because, Amanda, of the inspiration and the sharing that you do to other women. And I just want to thank you for this podcast being such an important and inspirational part of my own journey, and, helping me overcome that fear and finding the drive and determination. So thank you.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you. That means so much to me, and you have no idea. Hearing that continues to keep me inspired and going back to the why. And I really appreciate that. So thank you so much. And thank you for coming on the show. Why don't we end with you sharing with my listeners where they can connect with you and learn more about you and your business?
Absolutely. Well, I hang out mostly on Instagram, and because of the interior styling work that I do, I'm very visual. So you can find me on Instagram at gratify_home and online at gratifyhome.com. And I love to DM, and I'm getting much better with my introvert self at connecting online. And I would love to connect with you on Instagram. I've got weekly content and teaching that I do to give tips on sustainable design. And I would absolutely love to connect with you.
Amazing. Well, Kelly, thank you so much for coming on the She Did It Her Way podcast. Everyone, until next time, keep doing it your way. If you enjoyed today's podcast episode, you can head on over to shediditherway.com, where you can access the entire vault of She Did It Her Way podcast episodes. And you can also access free trainings and resources all about how to make the ultimate leap from your 9 to 5. And if you enjoyed today's podcast episode, I would be so grateful if you headed on over to iTunes and left a review letting me know what you love about the She Did It Her Way podcast. Until next time, keep doing it your way.